Good morning, Montague Church, friends, family. It's wonderful to be together. It's wonderful to see and experience the Spirit of God moving through us today the way He has been. And this is something we pray for at the beginning of the service or early before we gather together, and I sense that is happening. So thanks to everyone who has participated today. Thank you, Corey, for sharing your story with peace, humility, and trust. We just jumped ahead to the end of the sermon, actually. But we're still going to go ahead. Before we begin, let me just remind you of a few things. We want to do this video for next Sunday, so the invitation is for you to grab your phone, record a video from home, or somewhere at a beach, wherever you want, and just tell us what you were thankful for. Share your gratitude with us. 30, 45 seconds, that's all it needs to be. Send it to me, and we're going to put that together for next Sunday. And to help you out with that, if you're not sure or want to do that on your own, we've set up a video station for you. So let your mind wander a little bit during the service, not too much, but think about what you were thankful for, and we'll record you. My daughter Sophia and Kate will do that for you right after the service. We have a little spot outside the doors here for you. But we also need your help with that, in that because background noise might be an issue. Take your visiting outside if you can, so that we can have as little as noise as possible in the foyer. Thank you for that. Also, we are going to do a post-church little barbecue next Sunday, just a way to celebrate Thanksgiving. Not much more than meat on a bun and an apple, maybe a little bit more, not much more, but it'll be us together, spending some time outdoors. Bring a lawn chair if you want. We want as many people outside for that as possible. We're going to pray for good weather, and so just some good time of fellowship after service next Sunday. And a reminder also, for those of you who have some daytime flexibility, have been around the church for some period of time, I'd love to gather you on Wednesday, October 13th to learn our history. I can't remember what time I said last week. I don't have it written down anywhere, but I'm going to say 2 p.m. and I'll remind you about that. So 2 p.m., regardless of what I said last week, 2 p.m. October the 13th. And I might just be even phoning a few of you and saying, I hope you can join us. I know not everybody has such flexibility, but we are going to read our Beatitudes this morning. I'm going to invite Chanel to come up and lead us in our reading.
Okay, so this is on. Okay. So I'll be reading from Matthew 5, from verse 2 to 12. Now it's on. And he began to teach them, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be fulfilled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called sons of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you.
Thank you, Chanel. A couple of weeks ago, or recently, in something that would be completely opposite to what we just heard from Jesus, the Russian military invited the Western media to come to a show and tell. They were flexing their muscles. They gathered together down somewhere near the border of Kazakhstan, close to Afghanistan, and they were saying, we want you to know that we are mighty, we are powerful, and if there's any terrorist threats on our domestic soil coming out of things happening in Afghanistan, we are ready for you. This is what was happening. Guns, tanks. We are strong, we are powerful, we will protect our soil. And of course, if you were a Russian person, if you lived in one of the major cities, and you now have this military might protecting you, that might bring some comfort to you. You might kind of like to see such a thing. And just as we have said over the last few weeks, the people of Israel at the time of Jesus, whom Jesus was speaking to, were looking for a Messiah. I'm a broken record on this, aren't I? I've said this week after week, but I think it's important for us to understand. They were looking for a Messiah who was going to come with the display of power and might, consolidate things and overthrow the Roman occupiers. That's who they were looking for. And in fact, I think we can even find that in the words of Zechariah. Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, you remember that story, after his period of forced silence, at the birth of his son, prophesies. And these are the words of his prophecy. They're going to be up on the screen, but if you want to read along in your Bible, it is in Luke chapter 1, starting at verses 68. Zechariah prays, or prophesies. Blessed be the Lord God of Israel, for he has visited and redeemed his people, and has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he spoke by the mouth of his holy prophets from of old, that we should be saved from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show the mercy promised to our fathers, and to remember his holy covenant, the oath that he swore to our father Abraham to grant us, that we, being delivered from the hand of our enemies, might serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all our days. And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways, to give knowledge of salvation to his people, in the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, whereby the sunrise shall visit us from on high, to give light to those who sit in darkness, in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the way of peace. We hear from the words of Zechariah in this prophecy, this idea that the Messiah is to come and to restore their land, is to take it back, is to help them recover what they have lost, to fulfill what their desires. And along comes Jesus, and he says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And we're going to spend our time today unpacking this idea of meekness. But there's a lot there behind inherit the earth that we don't have time to understand. But I think I just want to say two things about it. The listeners at that time who were listening to Jesus, when they heard earth, they were understanding the occupied land of Israel. When the readers of Matthew, decades later, and for us, when we hear earth, our mind has been expanded, our imagination has been expanded, and we can understand this as talking about the kingdom of God. The whole earth is the Lord's. Everything belongs to God. He has come to restore it all. The promise of the future of the kingdom of God is for a new heaven and a new earth. That is what we can imagine as we hear they will inherit the earth. But for the people of the time, of course, they were thinking about this occupied territory in which they were living. A couple of things about the, now getting back to this idea of the word meek and unpacking that a little bit. A couple of things about it. First of all, when Jesus says, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth, he's actually quoting from Psalm 37. So as someone who had been raised in the Hebrew scriptures, Jesus would know this psalm, and the listeners being raised in the Hebrew scriptures would be familiar with this. And they would have, we're not going to read the whole psalm, but I've got a few verses up here. And this is from Psalm 37. First one, fret not yourself because of evildoers. Be not envious of wrongdoers, for they will soon fade like the grass and wither like the green herb. Verses 8 to 11, refrain from anger and forsake wrath. Fret not yourself, it tends only to evil. For the evildoers shall be cut off, but those who wait for the Lord shall inherit the land. In just a little while the wicked will be no more. Though you look carefully at his place, he will not be there. But the meek shall inherit the land and delight themselves in abundant peace. This familiar psalm, like Jesus' words, is a psalm that is speaking to poor peasant farmers who are living under the threat of evil and oppressive landowners. Something that would have been familiar, again, to those first century listeners to to the words of Jesus. And the idea that the meek will inherit the land, this is an upside-down thing, but it's also reminding the audience that this is not a new idea, that idea existed in the time of David when he wrote that song. So this idea is not new. Jesus would have been conjuring up an old image from Psalm 37. The second thing to understand here is the use of the word meek. The Greek word is praeos. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. John could correct me later if he likes. I'm going to say praeos. It's a word that shows up very rarely in the New Testament. It shows up in one other place outside of the Gospel of Matthew, and it shows up twice, 2 other times in the Gospel of Matthew. And it's worth looking at those 2 occasions where the word praeos, translated meek, in the Beatitudes shows up. This word, praeos, speaks about a relationship between people. So it's a word that we as a church should care about because it speaks about how we as a community of people relate to one another. And in each case, it describes Jesus' posture towards others. It describes Jesus' posture towards us. Live in meekness towards one another as I am with you would be what Jesus might be saying here. Or Matthew saying about how Jesus relates to others. So the first example, and both of these are going to be very familiar to you if you've been around the Bible for a little while. The first is in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 to 30. It says, Jesus says to his followers, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle, I am praeos. I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The other use of this word is found in Matthew 21. This is Matthew citing the prophecy of Zechariah. The scene will be familiar to you again. It's the beginning of Holy Week, Palm Sunday we call it, as Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. He's riding on a donkey. And the words are, "Say to the daughter of Zion, behold, your king is coming, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden." So Matthew is showing us in these cases that meekness is gentleness towards one another, and it's humility towards one another. Jesus to us to one another. How do we relate together as people, as a faith community, as a church community, in gentleness towards one another and in humility towards one another? And in both of these cases, Jesus talking about the yoke and his burden, and Jesus riding into Jerusalem on a donkey, these stand in contrast again to the Roman Empire. What is the yoke of the Roman Empire? It is burdensome. It is oppressive. How would the Roman emperor or a king or an official ride into Jerusalem? Not on a donkey, on a big black stallion with a great chariot. That would be the picture of the Roman Empire. And Jesus is talking about something very different here. So what does Psalm 37 and the use of the word meek in Matthew teach Jesus' listeners today? Again, by reference in Psalm 37, Jesus is reminding his listeners that there is the promise of land. But the way to it is not returning evil for evil. He denounces evil in Psalm 37. Evil is denounced there. It's not returning violence for violence. As people under Roman occupation, one of their options was to join the Zealots. The Zealots were the people who were planning to overthrow their oppressors. Jesus was saying, that's not the way. That's not the way that I'm leading you to. That's not what I'm planning. And in fact, the psalm says in its opening words, those who do evil are like the grass that withers under the wilting heat of the sun. And again, as agrarian people, that's an image that would have been very familiar to them. They would have understood, that would have made sense to them. The evil are going to wither under the heat of the sun. So simply put, Jesus is calling his followers to a new way, and it's a way marked by non-violence in the face of oppression. But the question you might have, and I think many of us have in this contemporary world, is, isn't meekness weakness? Isn't it just being weak? Is Jesus just telling us to be weak people? Is that who we want to be? That maybe doesn't fit too well. We don't feel comfortable with that. Well, I do think we could see that the word meekness in the modern world has been equated with weakness. And you might get a hint of that, or I believe we get a hint of that from some artwork from the 1630s by a French artist named Le Sueur called Meekness. This is the image in our modern time of meekness. It's feminine, it's gentle, it's a young woman stroking the head of a lamb who's nuzzling in the palm of her hand. This is the understanding of meekness. It feels to us a little bit weak. But historically, prior to modern times, we can understand that meekness has not been understood that way. And so I want us to look about how do we live as meek people in this world that is contrary to this picture of just sort of this passive weakness. And so there's three things I believe that we have. First of all, meekness is understanding meekness as a teachable spirit. We can look to the great story of, the tragic story really, of David and Bathsheba and the prophet Nathan. If you remember that story told in 1 Samuel or in 2 Samuel chapter 12, David stays home while the armies are out fighting in the season of war, and having too much time on his hands, he's up on his rooftop, he spots a woman, and he chooses to take her for his own possession. He brings Bathsheba over, he sleeps with her, she goes back to her home, she sends word that she is pregnant. David begins his great cover-up. He calls home her husband, hoping that he would then go and sleep with his wife, but he refuses to because he's an honorable man, and he chooses not to go back, but to sleep in the doorway in the courts. And so the plan is not working for David as he had expected. So he sends out word to his commander, to the general of the army, Joab, and he says, "Put this man Uriah out to the front lines. I want him killed." And so he conspires to have this man killed, the husband of Bathsheba. All this happens, and Nathan the prophet comes to David, this powerful man. Nathan the prophet comes to him, and he tells him this little story. And he tells him the story of a rich man and a poor man. The rich man has multiple flocks. The poor man has one little ewe. The rich man has a visitor. The rich man takes the lamb from this poor man, slaughters it, and when David hears, for the feast, and when David hears that story, he says, "Death to that guy." And David says, "You are that guy." Now, of course, Nathan says that to David. And of course, Nathan was putting his life on the line there, wasn't he? By confronting David that way. David is all powerful, and his response demonstrates to us meekness. He could have responded differently to Nathan, but he recognizes himself in this story that Nathan gave, and he says, "I have sinned against the Lord." Meekness as a teachable spirit is one way for us to understand. How do we live as meek people? We are people who, to be meek means to be teachable, to be willing to be called out when we are wrong, and to respond not with aggression, not with violence, not with defensiveness, but to be teachable and humble before that when we recognize such a situation. A second way that we can understand meekness is as restraint of anger. Aristotle, a Greek philosopher, of course, whose name you might recognize or you might have studied him, says, "A meek person is a person who is angry at the right things and with the right people, and further as he ought, when he ought, and as long as he ought. One of my first jobs coming out of college, my first college diploma was in horticulture and landscaping. And I got this job with a landscape company, and I was one day put on a crew with 4 of us, and we were going around doing residential lawn cutting. 4 of us working, 2 of us finished a few minutes earlier than the lead hand and another woman who were still working. And so we put our stuff away, and we were just kind of waiting by the truck and having a little casual conversation. Well, that did not go over very well with the boss. He did not like that. And he came back to the truck, and he was angry. We got back in the truck. He drove us back to the shop, and he fired us. The 2 of us. We were fired. Now, the next day, the boss, the owner, calls me up, and he gives me my job back. But this man, he was angry. Sure, I should have not done what I had done. I should have thought of something to do. But his anger was sort of way over here instead of missing an opportunity to teach me and this other guy about, here's what you should do when you've done all your job. Maybe come see me, ask me for more to do or something. But his anger was completely displaced. Jesus is saying, I think what we can understand by meekness is that meekness has a restraint of anger. We can even contrast this with Jesus' example, picking up the story in Matthew 21. Jesus rides into Jerusalem on the donkey, and then we know that shortly after he visits the temple, and he finds the money changers, and he overturns the tables of the money changers. And we know that story so well. It's an expression, and we understand this as appropriate anger towards a situation where the poor are being oppressed, and so he responds appropriately. And what happens after that instance immediately is that the lame and the blind come to Jesus. They recognize in Jesus that, he's not this angry guy that we have to avoid because he's so explosive we can't trust him. They actually come to him in trust because they saw that his anger was placed correctly. His anger was there to protect them, and they come to him for healing of their lameness, of their blindness and their physical disability. They recognize that Jesus is someone who they can trust even in this display of anger, because they recognize that it's properly placed and appropriately placed. There's a redeeming element to Jesus' anger there in that story. And then thirdly, we can understand meekness as the refusal to take revenge. And again, Jesus, as we look towards the end of Jesus' life, we can see in the events surrounding it, we can see so much of this. Jesus in the events leading to his death, his submission to the arresting authorities, unlike the one disciple who took out the sword and lopped off the one guy's ear. Jesus says, put away the sword, and he submits to the arresting authorities because he knows the plan. His restoration of Peter after Peter's denial. Peter denies him 3 times. Jesus, after his resurrection, restores him 3 times. This is a display of meekness. This is not Jesus taking revenge on Peter. It is Jesus restoring Peter. And of course, the forgiveness that Jesus extends to those who have hung him up on the cross when he says, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they are doing. Jesus is extending forgiveness, not seeking in some way revenge for these circumstances. Meekness is not weakness. Meekness is choosing nonviolence. Meekness is choosing to be teachable in situations where we know that we are wrong. Meekness is practicing restraint and directing our anger appropriately, directing it towards injustice. And meekness is refusing to take revenge, but instead extending forgiveness. As I said at the beginning here, a prominent word today has been humility. Meekness and humility, I think we could say, are synonymous with one another, as are mourning and humility from the second beatitude, and this idea of being poor in spirit and humility from the first beatitude. And so as we come to the end of these first 3 beatitudes, The call for us as individuals and the call for us as a church community is to be people of humility, to be filled and to foster humility, to admit when we are wrong, to refuse to be angry, and in an unrestrained way, to refuse to take revenge. Scott McKnight, theologian, would call this measurement a revolution of evaluation. What does it mean to be a Christian? How do we measure our spirituality? Often as a church, we might measure it by externals. Does this person read and pray every day? Does this person attend church weekly? Do they tithe? Do they know their Bible well? Have they been successful in business? And we might measure a person's spirituality by these externals. A revolution of evaluation would say those might be good outcomes of spirituality or indicators of spirituality, but we measure one's spirituality by the inward disposition of humility. So the real question is, do we as individuals in a community pursue these other things with humility? These other things of reading and praying and tithing. Do we pursue those things with humility, recognizing and trusting God to form us into the people that He means for us to be? In real estate, of course, the adage is location, location, location. We might say, as followers of Jesus, as we come to the end of these first three Beatitudes, we who are dependent on Him and who trust in Him, it is humility, humility, humility. May God bless us as we trust in Him and as we pursue humility and meekness to His glory. I'll call the worship team back up.